Hello and welcome to my presentation on ecotourism. Today we will be discussing tourism, its economic, environmental, and social impact, what ecotourism is and how it aims to mitigate tourism's negative impacts, and how ecotourism can benefit you as a consumer, and more specifically how consumers in the Bay Area can implement the tenets of ecotourism in their vacations. So before we can discuss ecotourism, we must first address the existing industry of tourism. Forms of tourism have been around since the dawn of civilization in the forms of political leaders and nobles visiting neighbor city-states. However, accessible tourism has been around for a much shorter amount of time, specifically in the United States. Tourism and the idea of family vacation simply weren't mainstream until automobiles became widely affordable during the 1930s, when 4 out of 5 families in the United States owned a car. The total number of cars increased from 8 million to 23 million. Traveling within your country of residence is considered domestic tourism, and there are several advantages and disadvantages to domestic tourism, which we will revisit later. International tourism did not become accessible to the public until around the 1970s, when flights became more popular and more accessible. So, tourism is a multi-billion-dollar industry, being the export for many states such as Hawaii and many major cities such as Paris, Tijuana, and Rome. Many believe that tourism is a good thing for people who rely on its economic profit to make a living. However, imagine if everyone stopped visiting Hawaii, how would Hawaii then support itself? So now let's define ecotourism. According to the International Organization of Ecotourism, ecotourism is defined as the responsible travel to natural areas that conserves the environment, sustains the well-being of local people, and involves interpretation and education. So let's take a look at how communities such as Hawaii ended up in the predicament of requiring tourism to function economically. So in the documentary Cannibal Tours, a group of indigenous people to New Guinea, the Lutmo, are highlighted, and in the 1980s they were being exploited by American and European tourists. At the time of recording, the Lutmo people had been colonized for just one generation. The elders could still recount how their society was before Westerners. However, their children only knew of the New World. Before Westerners, the Lutmo people had no concept of money. They foraged what they needed from their environment and didn't take any extra. They were peaceful people, with little conflict occurring. The only hint of violence was a practice of cannibalism, which to them was a sacred religious practice, not done out of malice, but rather out of communion. Any theologian could attest that this is no different from a church sourcing their wine from a producer who underpaid their laborers. However, with the introduction of the Western market economy, the Lutmo people quickly became enamored by luxury goods offered by the Westerners, such as tobacco, candy for their children, and photographs of their very own village. And to compete in the market economy, one must export a product. For the Lutmo people, this product became their culture. The documentary shows the lengths at which Westerners took advantage of their position to force the Lutmo people to sell handmade religious momentums, perform sacred dances, and allow them to observe ceremonies for literal pennies. Cases such as this are not uncommon. Similarly, in Hawaii in 1959, Americans forced the indigenous people to join the United States, in which case they lost rights to their land. Not to mention that to Hawaiian society, land ownership wasn't even a concept. Similarly, tourism has become a main export for Hawaii, as Hawaiians are forced to sell their culture just to feed their children. Today, indigenous groups are still protesting the illegal annexation of Hawaii and actively desire the United States to remove themselves from the island. Now, this isn't to bash anyone's dream vacation or honeymoon, as it is important to be aware of the impacts tourism has. And tourism can be a good thing. In fact, my very existence is a result of tourism. My parents met in Argentina as my father worked in Latin America for some time and would travel during his time off, whereas my mom, being a local to Chile, a neighboring country to Argentina, happened to run into him at a glacier. And so, in a weird way, if commercial tourism wasn't a thing, I wouldn't be here to be able to give this presentation on why commercial tourism is bad. And, as much as I'm grateful to be alive, unfortunately, I'm completely removed from a large part of my identity. I speak Spanish very poorly. I know very little about Chilean traditions, and even so less of indigenous traditions such as the Mapuche people, of whom I'm only 3 generations separated from a relative who's 100% Mapuche. And to be honest, this is the reality that tourism causes. It waters down cultures, and it's something that saddens me that I'm so removed from my culture. And I imagine it's even worse for those who still live on their native land. So, from transitioning from the societal impact of tourism, there's also the environmental impact, and that's carbon emissions. Currently, the most popular form of transportation to a travel destination is either car or plane. I guess space travel just really hasn't taken off yet. So planes being a huge issue, planes being a huge issue in efficiency and quantity. According to the International Council of Clean Transportation, commercial flights have seen a 32% increase of emissions released from the last 5 years, which was 70% higher than what was predicted. So what does that mean for an individual? What does it matter if I specifically do or do not take a flight? So let's look at what kind of carbon footprint I would leave if I took a plane from San Francisco to Hawaii. According to the International Council of Clean Transportation, you can calculate the total amount of fuel used by a passenger by dividing the total passenger weight by a total freight weight and multiplying that by the total fuel use. So, before we begin this next part, I'd like to just mention that this took the longest amount of time to complete, but it was honestly the most fun. I'm going to have to take a deep breath to get through this. So first we calculate the total passenger weight by adding the total weight of seats and weights of passengers. So let's take a Boeing 737, which holds up to 162 passengers. Assuming it's a completely booked flight, the total passenger weight is now 53,589.78 pounds, according to Carbon Independent. A plane uses 3.6 tons of fuel to travel 575.39 miles. Google Maps tells us that the distance from San Francisco to Hawaii is 2,341.86 miles. Additionally, according to Aeropedia, a Boeing 737-800 weighs 155,500 pounds when loaded. Plugging those numbers in, we can find that we need 10,137.15 pounds of jet fuel. According to a statement released by the United States Marine Corps describing the characteristics of jet fuel weighs 6.8 pounds per U.S. gallon, which means that we're burning 68,864.3 gallons of jet fuel to move a Boeing 737-800 with 162 passengers. And finally, according to the EIA, burning jet fuel produces 21.5 pounds of carbon dioxide per gallon, which would then equate to 148,589.61 pounds of carbon dioxide per plane of 162 passengers. So for one passenger taking one-way trip to Hawaii, they would emit 9,139.44 pounds of carbon dioxide. So that's still a pretty arbitrary number, and I think to most people that wouldn't really mean much, so we still need to find something to compare it with. And I think this is a good time to revisit our definition of what ecotourism is. Ecotourism is responsible travel that conserves the environment and sustains the well-being of local people. So keeping that in mind, what are some other options that we could go to rather than Hawaii? One really great option is San Diego if you still want to keep some warm, sunny beach vibes. And San Diego is well within driving distance from San Francisco. Plus, it's a popular vacation spot. California is a dream for people across all over the world to visit, and we have the luxury of being right here. So, according to Google, the distance from San Francisco to San Diego is 458.52 miles. Now, I'm a proud owner of a 2009 Toyota Matrix, which averages 29 miles to the gallon on highways. According to the EPA, vehicles manufactured before 2012 on an average produce 19.59 pounds of carbon dioxide per gallon of gasoline, which means that I would put out 309.74 pounds of carbon dioxide if I were to drive from San Francisco to San Diego, rather than the 9,139.44 to fly to Hawaii. And so overall, there's a lot of benefits to travel just through California rather than to travel overseas. There's lots of really great food here. There's amazing people, and it's so much better for the environment. It's so much better for the environment to just drive around California. It's even better if you have an electric vehicle. That would be optimal. But there's so much. There's San Francisco, there's Santa Cruz, there's San Diego, there's Northern California. There's just so much. There's so much that we're missing out on. So here are my image sources. Here are my research sources. Thank you. Have a lovely rest of your day.